Hey everybody, and welcome back to our reading of F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. Today we're going to be jumping in and reading Chapter 4, but before we do that we can just briefly recap Chapter 3. In Chapter 3 we finally got to attend one of Gatsby's infamous parties. Nick goes over to his house. He's actually invited, he receives an invitation, but finds Gatsby's house completely stuffed to the gills with strangers, with people who just drove in from New York, with con artists, with drunken men and women from all over the place. And the only thing that all these strange people seem to have in common is that they don't know Gatsby. So people are just showing up at Gatsby's house, drinking his booze, eating his food, trashing the place, and don't ever bother to meet their host. I mean, that tells us something about them. It seems that the only thing that people know about Gatsby, or think they know about Gatsby, are a series of very strange and sinister rumors about who he really is. The crowd seems to believe that he's not who he says he is, and some people think that he's a spy, or he's an assassin, or that he's, second cousin to the German Kaiser, and all these strange theories about who this guy really is. So there's a sense of mystery, of like a sinister mystery with Gatsby in the background. And Nick ultimately winds up meeting Gatsby. Gatsby's very friendly to him. He invites him over in the future. And in this chapter, Chapter 4, is going to be the first time that they really spend an extended amount of time together, and we'll learn about Gatsby's past from Gatsby's perspective. He'll tell us a little bit about his past, but as we'll see, it kind of raises more questions than it actually answers based upon what he has to say. So unlike previous chapters, we're not just going to jump right in with the first pages of Chapter 4. There's about 3 pages in here where Fitzgerald is kind of like writing a running joke, making fun of like the funny names of rich people and making all these allusions to people who really existed back then, but I'm not terribly concerned with establishing all the background to make that worthwhile to us at all. There might be someone out there who thinks that these pages are the most important pages in the book or something like that, but for my money, I think we can skip them for right now. So if you're using the electronic version, this starts on page 68 on the paragraph that begins at 9 o'clock one morning, okay? At 9 o'clock one morning, late in July, Gatsby's gorgeous car lurched up the rocky drive to my door and gave out a burst of melody from its 3-noted horn. It was the first time he had called on me, though I had gone to 2 of his parties, mounted in his hydroplane, and at his urgent invitation made frequent use of his beach. "Good morning, old sport. You're having lunch with me today, and I thought we'd ride up together." He was balancing himself on the dashboard of his car with that resourcefulness of movement that is so peculiarly American, that comes, I suppose, with the absence of lifting work or rigid sitting in youth, and even more with the formless grace of our nervous, sporadic games. This quality was continually breaking through his punctilious manner in the shape of restlessness. He was never quite still. There was always a tapping of a foot somewhere, or the impatient opening and closing of a hand. So we know that Gatsby likes to present himself as this high-class, high-society guy, but just picture this scene that we see. He pulls up to Nick's house unannounced in a gigantic car, and we'll learn about this car later. He lays on the horn, which is one of those 3-note horns, like bah, 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 like one of those or something. And then by the time Nick walks out the door, he's standing up on the dashboard, waving his arms, like, "Hey, we're going to lunch, let's go." I mean, there's no doubt that this car is expensive, that his clothes are expensive, but he's not exactly acting like a super classy guy. And Nick even notices that there's always this this nervousness, this movement, this sporadicness of his character that's kind of always breaking through this facade of refinement that he presents. He saw me looking with admiration at the car. "It's pretty, isn't it, old sport?" He jumped off to give me a better view. "Haven't you ever seen it before?" I'd seen it. Everyone had seen it. It was a rich cream color, bright with nickel, swollen here and there in its monstrous length with triumphant hat boxes and supper boxes and tool boxes, and terraced with a labyrinth of windshields that mirrored a dozen suns. Sitting down behind the many layers of glass in a sort of green leather conservatory, we started to town. I had talked with him perhaps a half a dozen times in the past month, and found to my disappointment that he had very little to say. So my first impression, that he was a person of some undefined consequence, had gradually faded, and he had become simply the proprietor of an elaborate roadhouse next door. And then came that disconcerting ride. We hadn't reached West Egg Village before Gatsby began leaving his elegant sentences unfinished and slapping himself indecisively on the knee of his caramel-colored suit. "Look here, old sport," he broke out surprisingly. "What's your opinion of me anyhow? I mean, what a thing to just like come right out and ask someone, right? What do you think of me? I mean, he's clearly very desperate for Nick's validation. I mean, that's kind of a very awkward thing to ask somebody. Well, what's your opinion of me? It shows a deep insecurity, right? And when we see that there's kind of this like double Gatsby, there's the outside shell of class and refinement, and then there's kind of something underneath. Maybe that's why he's so kind of insecure, because he doesn't know how well people are accepting his character. But we'll see how Gatsby takes this. A little overwhelmed, I began the generalized evasions which that question deserves. Well, I'm going to tell you something about my life, he interrupted. I don't want you to get the wrong idea from all these stories you hear. So he was aware of the bizarre accusations that flavored conversation in his halls. I'll tell you God's truth. His right hand suddenly ordered divine retribution to stand by. I'm the son of some wealthy people in the Middle West, all dead now. I was brought up in America, but educated at Oxford because all my ancestors have been educated there for many years. It is a family tradition. He looked at me sideways, and I knew why Jordan Baker believed he was lying. He had hurried the phrase, educated at Oxford, or swallowed it or choked on it as though it had bothered him before. And with this doubt, his whole statement fell to pieces. I wondered if there wasn't something a little sinister about him after all. So you can tell he's lying here just with how he's presenting this information. What part of the Middle West? I inquired casually. San Francisco. I see. And I'll put a map up here so that you know exactly what the Middle West is. Places like Wisconsin and Minnesota. No one from San Francisco would call San Francisco the Midwest. So right off the bat, we're like, if you're from where you say you're from, that doesn't make sense, right? And what else does he say? Oh, I was born in a very rich family, but they're all dead now, so you can't corroborate his story at all. And I was educated at Oxford because all the people in my family are educated there. Oxford's a very, very fancy, high society university in England. Let's see what else he has to say about his early life here. My family all died, and I came into a good deal of money. His voice was solemn, as if the memory of that sudden extinction of a clan still haunted him. For a moment I suspected he was pulling my leg, but a glance at him convinced me otherwise. After that I lived like a young Rajah in all the capitals of Europe. Paris, Venice, Rome, collecting jewels, chiefly rubies, hunting big game, painting a little, things for myself only, and trying to forget something very sad that happened to me long ago. I mean, doesn't this sound like the back of some like trashy drugstore novel? Like, oh, I lived in all the capitals of Europe hunting big game, like shooting many tigers in Paris. Like, what are you talking about? I was collecting rubies. I mean, these are not things that people do. They're things that, like, you would assume rich people might do if you didn't know any better, which sheds a lot of doubt on his whole story here. With an effort, I managed to restrain my incredulous laughter. The very phrases were so worn, so threadbare, that they evoked no image except that of a turbaned character leaking sawdust at every pore as he pursued a tiger through the Bois de Boulogne. Then came the war, old sport. It was a great relief. I tried very hard to die, but I seemed to bear an enchanted life. I accepted a commission at first lieutenant when it began. In the Argonne Forest, I took 2 machine gun detachments so far forward that there was a half-mile gap on either side of us where the infantry couldn't advance. We stayed there 2 days and 2 nights, 130 men with 16 Lewis guns. And when the infantry came up at last, they found the insignia of 3 German divisions among the piles of the dead. I was promoted to be a major, and every Allied government gave me a decoration. Even Montenegro, little Montenegro, down on the Adriatic Sea. So now he's telling his war stories. And he says, oh yeah, I took my men with 2 machine gun divisions, and we defeated the entire German army. I mean, not literally, but he says that he basically defeated 3 divisions with, 16 men? No, 16 guns. With 30 men. Sure thing, Jay. Absolutely. At this point, Nick is like, there's no way that like, this guy's full of it, right? But something happens to add some color to this, I think. Little Montenegro. He lifted the words and nodded at them with his smile. The smile comprehended Montenegro's troubled history and sympathized with the brave struggles of the Montenegrin people. It appreciated fully the chain of national circumstances which had elicited this tribute from Montenegro's warm little heart. My incredulity was submerged in fascination now. It was like skimming hastily through a dozen magazines. So Nick's like, this guy's so full of it. But then, he reached in his pocket, and a piece of metal slung on a ribbon fell into my palm. That's the one from Montenegro. To my astonishment, the thing had an authentic look. Ordere di Danilo, ran the circular legend. Montenegro, Nicholas Rex. Turn it. Major J. Gatsby, I read. For valor extraordinary. So after telling this crazy war story, he pulls out the medal that he won. And it looks like it's legit. It's got his name on it and everything. Here's another thing I always carry. A souvenir of Oxford days, taken at Trinity Quad. The man on my left is now the Earl of Doncaster. It was a photograph of a half a dozen young men in blazers, loafing in an archway through which were visible a host of spires. And there was Gatsby, looking a little, not much younger, with a cricket bat in his hand. Then it was all true. I saw the skins of tigers flaming in his palace on the Grand Canal. I saw him opening a chest of rubies to ease, with their crimson-lighted depths and the gnawings of his broken heart. So he tells this ridiculous story. It seems like it can't possibly be true. But then what does he pull out of his pocket? Here's the medal I won when I defeated the Germans. Here's a photograph of me at Oxford. I mean, do you carry with you little souvenirs that prove your past with you all the time? I mean, the fact that he brought them with him suggests something, that he's like desperate to prove that this story is true, or at least the story is partially true, because some of those things he was saying still don't really make a lot of sense to me. But that's very unusual. And it shows how desperate he is to win Nick's trust, or win Nick's affection, or show Nick that he is who he says he is. I'm going to make a big request of you today, he said, pocketing his souvenirs with satisfaction. So I thought you ought to know something about me. I didn't want you to think I was just some nobody. You see, I usually find myself among strangers because I drift here and there trying to forget the sad thing that happened to me. He hesitated. You'll hear about it this afternoon. At lunch? No, this afternoon I happened to find out that you're taking Miss Baker to tea. Do you mean you're in love with Miss Baker? No, old sport, I'm not. But Miss Baker has kindly consented to speak to you about this matter. I hadn't the faintest idea what this matter was, but I was more annoyed than interested. I hadn't asked Jordan to tea in order to discuss Mr. J. Gatsby. I was sure the request would be something utterly fantastic, and for a moment I was sorry I had ever set foot upon his overpopulated lawn. So Gatsby's like, I'm going to ask you to do me a favor. And Nick says, okay, what's the favor? And he's like, oh, Jordan will tell you about it later. So Gatsby has like created this elaborate plan, this elaborate set of circumstances where, he's informed Miss Baker about his request, and then he knew that she was going to tea with Nick, so that she'll ask Nick. It's this whole unnecessarily complicated thing that makes us wonder, like, what is Gatsby getting at here? Like, if you need something, why don't you just ask for it? So there's a strange request coming down the line, as we'll see. We'll go just a little bit further now. He wouldn't say another word. His correctness grew on him as we neared the city. We passed Port Roosevelt, where there was a glimpse of red-belted ocean-going ships, and sped along a cobbled slum lined with dark, undeserted saloons of the faded gilt of the 1900s. Then the Valley of Ashes opened on both sides of us, and I had a glimpse of Mrs. Wilson, straining at the garage pump, with panting vitality as we went by. With fenders spread like wings, we scattered light throughout half Astoria, only half, for as we twisted among the pillars of the elevated, I heard the familiar jug-jug spat of a motorcycle, and a frantic policeman rode alongside. So Gatsby's driving like crazy, like mad, through Long Island and into the city, and he's driving so recklessly that a police officer on a motorcycle pulls up next to them, right? All right, old sport, called Gatsby. We slowed down. Taking a white card from his wallet, he waved it before the man's eyes. Right you are, agreed the policeman, tipping his cap. Know you next time, Mr. Gatsby. Excuse me. What was that? I inquired. The picture of Oxford? I was able to do the commissioner a favor once, and he sends me a Christmas card every year. So, what we see in Gatsby is this juxtaposition of these ridiculous stories, things that just can't possibly be true. And then, almost immediately afterwards, we see some proof, at least of part of his story, right? There's no way he defeated the German army, yet here's the medal from Montenegro. Oh, he's from San Francisco in the Midwest and got sent to Oxford for college. Well, here's a picture of him at Oxford. And then, as he is about to get pulled over by the police, he just waves a little card in the policeman's face, and the policeman says, "Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Gatsby." So there's something going on with this guy. There's something underneath the surface. What it is, we don't know. Whether it's this fantastic story of him, hunting big game in the capitals of Europe, or maybe something a little more sinister. But clearly, he's got money and he's got power because that policeman's not going to mess with him, right? We'll get another little glimpse into Gatsby and his past as he and Nick head off to lunch, and we meet another character who adds a little color to Gatsby's backstory, as we'll see. But we'll discuss that next time. Keep on reading chapter 4, and I'll see you then.